So what does this budget represent for workers in the Isle of Man?
I think it's another under budget in terms of what it represents is the illusion of giving people something, giving them a little bit more, whilst in reality not delivering that at all. So in terms of the cuts to real income that people are seeing through rising inflation, an increase in the tax allowance or increases in benefits which don't actually match inflation are not giving anybody anything at all. It's just potentially masking or trying to mask the losses that real working people, whether they're public or private sector, are experiencing and have been for a very long time. And I'd also point to things like the so-called extra money for health, when health has been running over budget, allegedly, for many years. I think it's interesting to see a Treasury Minister continue the policy of not funding our health services properly and then accusing the department of going over a budget each year and then calling them to account for that. The additional monies that have been provided for health, I think it's somewhere in the region of 5.5 million, don't match we were told in January, 9.5 million that it's behind in the last year. So I think we've got a continuing problem in some of our biggest and most important departments that provide services for the most vulnerable people in the Isle of Man, being not allocated enough money yet again to do the job properly.
Now, going back to some of the measures that were outlined in the budget sort of across the board for people, including the personal allowance, the increase in the personal allowance, now you say that's effectively just masking the issue, but isn't something better than nothing?
Yeah, well, of course. It would be worse if there had been no increase. But what you've got to, you take a kind of a vox pop of people around you when these things happen, and I don't see anybody rushing out to celebrate. That just means they're still going to have less money in their pocket. It just could have been even less than it's going to be. Nobody's going to celebrate that. That's not exactly a win.
Now, looking at the public sector, the wage freeze, the 1% cap on wage increases in the government budget for wages has been kept in place in this budget. It's due to go up to 2% in the next financial year, that's 2019-2020, but it's allocated on the basis of need, they say. Now, how do you interpret that?
I'm not quite sure how to interpret that, because our members would say all over the public sector that with the cost of inflation, adding to erosions in their income, everybody needs, at least a 2% pay increase. What we've seen over the last few years is across the public sector, pay awards are coming in around the 2% mark, and that actually mirrors the private sector. So all the data that we've been able to look at, both here in the UK, indicates, average of about 2%, whether you work in the public or private sector over the last few years. So that's what I mean when I say pay increases are being under budgeted. If you know that you've been paying around the 2% mark, and you know that that's not likely to change because of the way the cost of living is going up, why would you budget 1%? And I think what the Treasury Minister here is doing is quite devious in a way. They're continuing a policy of, increasing pay budgets by 1%, knowing that the outcome of that will be, in effect, cuts to public services. In fact, interestingly, when Alf Cannon was negotiating pay in a previous role as chair of the Civil Service Commission, that was a point he made himself to me during one meeting, that anything above 1% was going to mean cuts to public services. So he knows that. And he knows that in all likelihood, pay increases will come in above that because of, the arguments are there for it to happen. So we see an interesting situation where the Treasury Minister, I think, is trying to shelve blame for, in effect, cuts to public services by, not providing enough staff to deliver those services, which is the net effect of freezing budgets, and is attempted to shelve blame onto public sector workers and their unions for that situation.
Couldn't it be argued that it's really down to it's part of the art of negotiation? If you say there is a 1% cap on wage increases or that budget within government, inevitably the unions are going to fight that. They're going to argue a case for more. If you set it at 2% and that's the maximum you're willing to go, the unions are still going to argue to go higher, and there is a risk that you will end up at, say, 3%.
We have made our arguments over successive years through the auspices of an independent arbitrator. And those arbitrators have, with a few exceptions, pegged pay rises at about 2%. So that's not me arguing that. That's somebody making that decision. I think what we got to be clear about here is when I talk about putting a cap on pay, and that meaning, in effect, cuts to public services, that doesn't mean that if there's a pay award above 1%, money is taken from other budgets to pay for that. All of the money for pay awards has to come from within the pay budget. It can't be taken away from schools or health services budgets. It's got to come from within the pay budget. Now, if you can't find that money, one of the things that you have to do is cut staff. And by and large, the government has done that not through a major and extensive programme of redundancies, but we believe by shaving off things like overtime, which is practically non-existent in large parts of the public sector now, but also more tellingly by holding vacancies and not filling them. So when you have less hours of work being done and less people to do them, the inevitable impact of that is you can offer less public services that are needed. And health's a good example of that. You can offer as many extra clinics, for example, as you like, but if you haven't got the staff needed to run those because you can't afford to employ or pay them to do it, you're not going to have health services. So, that's a very simplistic way of explaining it, but I think we've got to torpedo the suggestion that pay rises are, as budgeted, are paid for by borrowing and stealing from other, budget headings which are for public service provision.
Now, looking at one of the issues which is ongoing, public sector pensions, that's still a concern for the Isle of Man, for the government, and I suppose for all of the people in the Isle of Man, that plugging that deficit. What progress is being made on that front?
What we're looking at the moment, what's in development across several of the pension schemes, is a cost-sharing mechanism. This is a key plank of the most recent reforms, and indeed the reforms before that. It's one of the things that Prospect has been committed to from the outset. We see cost-sharing as a very sensible way to sustain pension provision in the future in a fair way. Pensions do continue to be a massive concern, but I think the main thing is that year on year our members are paying more and getting less and working longer. So they're making their contribution, and they're making their contribution in respect of their pensions and the pensions in future. There's this other issue about pension liability that is built up in the past, the so-called legacy problem. And our members aren't responsible for that. That was the responsibility of a government that decided to take the money that it should have been paying into pensions, that our members were paying into their pensions, and spend it on something else instead. So, over decades and decades, since pension schemes were set up, government did have the option to take that money to one side and hold it for when pensions became payable. It didn't. It built hospitals, roads, schools, and so on and so forth. And now our members, in some quarters, it's being suggested that, that's their fault and they should pay for it because they're going to get pensions in the future that they're paying more for. I think there is now an acceptance by this government, and certainly there was, we're not aware that it's changed, that the legacy issue that I've just described is not the responsibility of current scheme members. I would certainly not like to see that change. We had some concerns that when Alf Cannon, as Treasury Minister, decided to draw down the pensions reserve quicker, that might be a signal in future years that the legacy problem might be, it might be an excuse to come back at current scheme members over the legacy issue. So, fair warning, if that happens, there will be trouble. But the government hasn't given any indication that would be the case.